when you have seen in the George Floyd case most recently, you don't give law enforcement a pass. The question is, what is the correct response? And the radical groups that have been running the protests, which then led to riots, which have now kind of calmed down back into protest, they are now pushing something that I kind of feel like we've dealt with a lot before at the ACLJ when it comes to Israel. Let's just divest from the police. Let's defund the police. We don't need police.
Let me read to you what the council president of Minneapolis said. We're committed to dismantling the police as we know it in the city of Minneapolis and to rebuild with our community a new model of public safety that actually keep our community safe. They go on to say, when pressed for details about it, she said they really haven't worked through that yet, but they're going to start with funding. Obviously, they want to cut funding and more to a community-based strategy.
With this brutality that we're dealing with, the horrendousness of what happened with George Floyd, the murder there, that police need a lot more training. And they need to go back through their old training books, like Minnesota had to do, and say, hey, let's get rid of the chokehold. You know, that was still on the books.
I mean, it's not just what happened in Minneapolis. It's been many other states. We've seen it over the history. That has to go. But the answer cannot be, it's so simplistic. Oh, we'll just dismantle the police department, and then I was reading all these articles last night, and then we'll come up with something that may work. What's that something? Well, they really don't know. Well, maybe you should have the idea of what that's going to be before you start dismantling public safety.
The move to defund the police, which is growing, is also hugely paradoxical. This is so because defunding the police will leave our most vulnerable populations at risk. Consider a few facts. Black victims of police shootings represent 0.1% of all African Americans killed in 2019. So if you pull back the police, guess what? You leave the most vulnerable populations at risk. The most vulnerable populations largely consist of members of minority groups.
The answer is not to take the police force and to disband it and glue together a vigilante force subsequent to that to protect them. And I think Professor Hutchison's remarks are really telling. The most vulnerable are the minority and black communities, the poor Hispanic communities among us where there is rampant crime. Who are you going to call when you're being assaulted with a weapon? Who are you going to call when your house and your children are being sexually molested and hurt? Are you going to call a protester and to come and to save you? No, you call the police departments because these are the least of these who need the protection.
Just last night, 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council, the city where George Floyd died, pledged to, quote, begin the process of ending, not defunding, but ending the Minneapolis Police Department. The calls for dismantling the city police are perhaps the loudest from City Council member Jeremiah Ellison. He happens to be the son of the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison. The younger Ellison has said that after taking apart the police department, we're not simply going to glue it back together. So this isn't just reforming the police department. It's destroying the police department. We are going to dramatically rethink how we approach public safety and emergency response. It's really past due. Important to note, the younger Ellison previously tweeted during the riots, I hereby declare officially my support for Antifa. So that's the guy who's going to be leading the charge to reform what public security looks like in these areas in Minneapolis.
There is an unprecedented amount of consensus on the need for underlying reform on this issue. That is a political opportunity for progress. The vast majority of Americans will acknowledge the pain of our friends and neighbors who are hurting, and they want to help address the source of that pain. But Jay, in Washington, D.C., the reflex of the political left is always to run to the far left of these catastrophic proposals. I would associate myself with Professor Hutchison's comments about who would be the most impacted. It would be the most vulnerable. It's a tremendous overreaction, and it would make things worse.